In 1934, America was starving. Families in Oklahoma were boiling the same bones for the fourth time. Children in rural Mississippi were going to school on nothing but a biscuit and water. But 45 miles off the coast of San Francisco, on a cold rock in the middle of the bay, some of the most dangerous men in America were sitting down to hot breakfasts with choices. This is not just a story about criminals. It's a story about who this country decided deserved to eat, and what that says about every grandmother who was told her food was poor food. Number 25. Fresh-baked white bread, not yesterday's bread. Not bread from a tin. Not bread stretched with sawdust flour the way some mill towns were selling by 1932. Fresh bread, pulled from the oven that morning, set on the table warm. In 1934, a loaf of store bread cost about 8 cents. For families rationing every penny in the coal towns of West Virginia or the tenant farms of East Texas, that 8 cents had 3 other places it needed to go. They ate what they had. Stale cornbread, cold biscuits, sometimes nothing. The men on Alcatraz ate fresh bread as a daily standard. Not a reward, a standard. Warden James Johnston wrote it into the meal policy himself. He understood something the rest of the country was refusing to say out loud. Fed men don't riot. Hungry men do. The United States government knew exactly what food could do. They chose where to spend it. Number 24. Roast pork with pan gravy, Sunday dinner. That's what it was in a working-class home, if you were lucky enough to have it at all. A pork shoulder might come out once a month in a good household, once every 6 weeks in a struggling one. The women who made it happen stretched that roast across 3, sometimes 4 meals. The first night was the roast. The second night was the scraps in a stew. The third night was the bone, boiled down for broth. Nothing wasted. Not one drop. On Alcatraz, roast pork with pan gravy appeared on the weekly rotation as a matter of course. Not a holiday, not a reward for good behavior. Tuesday. It came out on a Tuesday, set in front of men who had robbed banks and broken federal law, without ceremony and without gratitude. Grandma just called it Sunday dinner. The prison called it midweek protein. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 23. Steamed clams. Alcatraz sat in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The water surrounding that island was full of Dungeness crab, bay clams, rockfish, and striped bass. The fishermen who worked those waters, Italian immigrants mostly, out of the North Beach docks, sold what they caught and brought home what didn't sell. Even they didn't always eat well. Their children remembered years when the catch was good and the prices were low, and the family ate fish 3 times a day because there was nothing else. The prisoners on Alcatraz ate steamed clams as a rotating menu item, documented, verified, on the actual menus preserved in the National Archives. Free families a mile from that same water were surviving on dried beans and fatback. The geography of it is almost too much to sit with. The clams were right there. The bay was right there. Who ate them was a policy decision. Number 22. Cream of tomato soup, not from a can. Real tomatoes, real cream, real stock, reduced down and seasoned by trained cooks on a federal payroll. In 1934, a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup cost 10 cents. For Depression families, that 10-cent can was a 2-meal event, diluted with extra water, stretched with a heel of bread, served to children who didn't complain because they didn't know to. Today we call scratch tomato soup a bisque and charge $14 for a bowl in a restaurant with exposed brick walls. Grandma just called it tomato soup. She made it with what she had, canned tomatoes from last summer, a spoon of flour, whatever milk wasn't needed for the morning. The Alcatraz version had cream, real cream, ladled into bowls for men doing federal time while free mothers were rationing the condensed version by the tablespoon. Number 21. Beef stew with root vegetables, real beef. Cube chuck, browned first in a hot pan, then slow-cooked for hours with carrots and potatoes and onions until the whole thing thickened into something that stuck to your ribs for the rest of the day. In the 1930s, beef was a luxury item for most working-class families. A pound of chuck cost about 12 cents in 1933. For a family of 5 in a Depression household, that 12 cents was a calculation. Beef stew, or a week's worth of dried beans. Most chose the beans. The Alcatraz kitchen made beef stew on rotation. And here is what the nutritionists know now that the grandmothers already knew then. Slow-cooked collagen from cheap cuts of beef delivers more bioavailable protein per penny than almost anything else you can put in a pot. The grandmothers who made it when they could weren't cooking poor food. They were cooking the smartest food on the table. The prisoners just got it more often. Number 20. Buttermilk pancakes hot off the griddle, stacked, with syrup, not molasses, not sorghum, actual maple-style syrup on the side. This was the Alcatraz breakfast rotation in the 1930s and 1940s, documented in the kitchen logs. In the Dust Bowl states, Oklahoma, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, families who had lost everything to the drought were feeding children on cornmeal mush and nothing else some mornings. Plain mush. No butter, no syrup, no sugar. You ate it because you had to, and you didn't say a word. Buttermilk itself was cheap, a byproduct of churning, often given away or sold for next to nothing. But the syrup was the thing, sweet, pourable, abundant. It sat on the Alcatraz table as a standard breakfast condiment, while free children in the southern plains were learning not to expect sweetness at all. Number 19. Baked beans. Here is the one item that actually crossed the line, that appeared on both the Alcatraz menu and on Depression-era family tables across the country. Dry navy beans cost 5 cents a pound in 1933. They fed a family of 5 for 2 days. Poor families knew this. Grandmothers knew this. They soaked them overnight, cooked them low and slow, and stretched them as far as they would go. But there is a difference between survival beans and Alcatraz beans. The prison kitchen added molasses, brown sugar, salt pork, thyme. They had the fuel to cook them properly. They had the budget for the extras. The free families version was beans and water and hope. The prison's version was a complete dish, sweet, savory, deeply cooked, the kind of thing that costs $18 at a farm-to-table restaurant in 2024. That is not progress. That is a rebranding of what poor women already knew how to make. Number 18. Chicken and dumplings. The smell of it was the thing. A whole chicken, simmered low for 2 hours until the meat fell off the bone, and then the dumplings, thick, soft, dropped into the broth by the spoonful and left to cook until they puffed up and turned translucent at the edges. In working-class homes across the rural South and the Midwest during the 1930s, chicken was not a casual protein. You ate chicken when one of the flock died, or when company came, or when someone was sick and needed the broth. A whole chicken appearing on a Tuesday for no reason was not something most families experienced. Alcatraz served chicken and dumplings on regular rotation, cooked by a trained kitchen staff, served to federal prisoners without ceremony or gratitude. Grandma just called it the good meal. She made it when she could, which wasn't often, and she stretched the broth for 2 more days after the meat was gone. They knew things about a chicken carcass that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 17. Vegetable beef soup. This is not soup from a can. This is not a bouillon cube dropped into hot water. This is bones, beef bones, roasted first until they turn deep brown, simmered for 6, 8, sometimes 12 hours, until the water turned amber and thick and the kitchen smelled like something ancient and nourishing. Then the vegetables, carrots, turnips, celery, onions, whatever was in season and in the Alcatraz storeroom. The Alcatraz kitchen employed trained cooks on a federal salary whose job was to produce food of a consistent standard. The grandmother in the coal mining towns of eastern Kentucky did the same work alone, at 4 in the morning, before her husband left for the mine, with no salary and no staff and no recognition. She made the same soup, from the same bones, with the same knowledge. She just did it on less, with more people to feed, and nobody ever wrote it down. Number 16. Baked macaroni and cheese. Not from a box. Not the bright orange powder that Kraft introduced in 1937 at 19 cents a package. marketed directly at Depression families as a miracle of modern convenience, a full meal for 4 people for under a quarter. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That box was not an improvement, it was a replacement. Grandmothers had been making baked macaroni with real sharp cheddar and a butter roux and a crispy breadcrumb top since before any of those executives were born. Kraft took that dish, stripped out the nutrition, stripped out the flavor, stripped out the craft, and sold the hollow version back to struggling families who couldn't afford the real thing anymore. The Alcatraz kitchen made the real thing, baked, with actual cheese melted through every layer. Served to men doing federal time while free mothers were adding extra water to the orange powder to make it stretch. That is not progress. That is theft. Dressed up as convenience and sold at 19 cents a box. Number 15, apple pie. Not just on holidays, on rotation. Alcatraz kitchen records document desserts appearing as a regular feature of the meal program, and apple pie was among them. Apples, lard crust, sugar, cinnamon. A complete pie, cut into slices and served to federal inmates as a standard component of the dining experience. In rural Georgia and Tennessee in the 1930s, a mother who wanted to make an apple pie for her family had to calculate the cost of the lard for the crust, the sugar for the filling, the fuel to run the oven. She made it when she could. When the apples came off the tree and the sugar wasn't too far out of reach and the oven could be justified. She made it, and she watched her children eat it, and that was the whole point. A convicted murderer on Alcatraz had apple pie on a Tuesday. She had to wait for circumstances to align. That is not a small thing. That is the entire story. Number 14, coffee hot. This one lands differently than the rest. Coffee was 26 cents a pound in the mid-1930s. For a family already stretched to nothing, coffee was a calculation, not a given. Families stretched it with chicory. Reused the grounds twice, sometimes 3 times, until the cup was barely brown water. Some gave it up entirely. Mothers who had drunk coffee their whole lives went without so the money could go somewhere that mattered more. On Alcatraz, coffee was not rationed. It was not a reward. It was not a privilege granted for good behavior. It was available, hot, every morning, as a basic feature of incarcerated life, unlimited. The smallest detail is sometimes the sharpest one. A free mother in rural Alabama rationed her coffee by the spoonful. The man who robbed her neighbor's bank had as much as he wanted before 8 in the morning. Number 13, fresh fruit. An orange in a Christmas stocking was a real gift in the 1930s. Not a token, not a symbol. A genuine, meaningful gift. Something sweet and bright and rare enough that children remembered it for the rest of their lives. Seniors who grew up during the Depression still talk about it. One orange, Christmas morning, the excitement of it. Fresh fruit was a luxury that millions of American families accessed only occasionally, at harvest time, at holidays, when someone had a tree in the yard and the season was right. The Alcatraz food program included fresh fruit on a rotating basis as a standard dietary component. Documented in the kitchen logs, verified in the National Archives, not a reward, a standard. The government knew that vitamin C prevented illness and that healthy inmates were easier to manage than sick ones. They fed the prisoners accordingly. Free children got 1 orange at Christmas. The men on the rock got fruit on a Tuesday. Number 12, corned beef hash. Hash was Depression food at its finest. Chopped corned beef, diced potato, onion, pressed flat into a hot pan until the bottom turned mahogany and crunchy, then flipped or folded and served hot. Families across New England and the industrial Midwest made it on Monday mornings from Sunday's leftover corned beef, if there was leftover corned beef, which was not always a given. Alcatraz served hash as a breakfast item, pan-fried by kitchen staff in heavy iron skillets, served alongside fresh eggs. The hash itself was honest food, Depression food, the kind of thing a grandmother would make without thinking twice. But the eggs alongside it, fresh eggs every time, without rationing, that was the tell. Free families in the 1930s kept chickens when they could and rationed every egg with the care of something precious. 2 eggs for the father before the mine, 1 for the oldest child. None for the mother who said she wasn't hungry and meant something else entirely. Number 11. Liver and onions. Liver was the one Depression-era food that free families actually had access to, because nobody wanted it and butchers practically gave it away. Beef liver ran about 5 cents a pound through most of the 1930s. It was the protein of last resort for families who had exhausted every other option. And yet, beef liver is one of the most nutrient-dense foods in the human diet, more iron per ounce than almost anything else. B12 folate. Vitamin A at levels that would make a modern supplement label blush. Grandma just called it liver night, and the children groaned, and she made them eat it anyway. She was right. She didn't know the science. She knew the outcome. She knew the children looked better after liver night than they did after cornmeal mush night. The Alcatraz kitchen served liver and onions on rotation, properly caramelized, properly seasoned, by cooks who had the time and the butter to do it right. Free families had the liver. They didn't always have the butter or the time. Number 10. Split pea soup. A pound of dry split peas cost 4 cents in 1933. 4 cents. Combined with a ham hock, or the bone from last week's ham if there was one, and a few hours on the back of the stove, it made something that fed a family of 5 for 2 full days. Split pea soup was everywhere in Depression-era America, in the farmhouses of Minnesota and Wisconsin, in the tenement kitchens of Lower Manhattan, in the mill worker homes of Pennsylvania. Everybody made it. Everybody ate it. The difference on Alcatraz was not the soup itself. It was the consistency. The freedom from the calculation of whether there was a ham bone. The certainty that the soup would be there, thick and hot, without the anxiety underneath it. Free families made split pea soup out of necessity and love and exhaustion. The Alcatraz kitchen made it out of a budget line and a menu rotation. Same soup, different everything else. Number 9. Cream-chipped beef on toast. The soldiers called it something less polite. But in civilian kitchens, in working-class homes across the Northeast and the mid-Atlantic states in the 1930s and 1940s, it was real food with a real place on the table. Thin-shaved dried beef, folded into a white cream sauce made from butter and flour and milk, poured over toast and served hot. Dried beef was affordable. It kept without refrigeration, stretched far, and delivered protein when fresh meat was out of reach. Alcatraz served it as a standard breakfast or lunch item. Families who made it at home made it because it was cheap and filling, and the children would eat it without argument. The cream sauce was the genius of it, a basic roux that could make almost anything taste like a complete meal. Grandmothers across the country made that roux without measuring, without thinking, without a recipe. They made it the way they breathed. That knowledge is almost entirely gone now. Number 8. Fried chicken. Not every Sunday, but on rotation, which meant more often than any free working-class family was sitting down to it. Fried chicken in a Depression-era household was an event. It required a whole bird, which required a bird you were willing to kill, which meant one less layer in the flock. It required fat, lard, or oil in quantities that had a cost. It required time, which a woman who had been on her feet since before sunrise often didn't have left by dinner. When it happened, it meant something. The children remembered those Sundays. The smell of the fat heating in the cast iron. The sound of it, that first loud sizzle when the piece hit the pan, then settling into a steady, rhythmic crackling. The color of the crust going from pale to gold to deep brown. Alcatraz served fried chicken on rotation as a menu standard. No event, no meaning, no memory attached to it. Just protein on a plate, served to men who didn't think about what it cost a woman to make it. Number 7. Mashed potatoes with butter. Potatoes were everywhere in the Depression. They grew in every climate. They stored through winter. They cost almost nothing, and they filled you up. A 10-pound sack of potatoes ran about 20 cents in 1933 and lasted a family of 4 the better part of 2 weeks. Grandmothers mashed them, fried them, roasted them, stretched them with everything that needed stretching. Mashed potatoes were not remarkable, but butter was. Real butter, not lard, not margarine that was being marketed hard to depression families as a modern alternative. Real butter on mashed potatoes was a small act of abundance in a time that had very little of it. Alcatraz served mashed potatoes with butter as a standard side. Across the country, free families were choosing between butter and something else that needed buying. Some of them chose the margarine. Some of them chose nothing. The prisoners had it without choosing at all. Number 6. Bread pudding with vanilla sauce. This is the one that tells you everything about how this country relates to poverty and food. Bread pudding was born from nothing, from the bread that was going stale, from the eggs and milk that needed using, from the cook who refused to waste what little she had. You tore the old bread into a pan, poured a custard of eggs and milk and whatever sweetness you could afford over the top, and baked it until it puffed and set and turned golden. What came out was not poor food. It was transformation. It was a cook taking the end of things and making something better out of them. Depression grandmothers made bread pudding because it was the only thing left to do with the bread. Alcatraz made it as a dessert with a poured vanilla sauce on top, as a planned menu feature. Today we call it bread pudding, and charge $12 for it at brunch restaurants that describe it as a classic American comfort food. They have no idea who made it first, or why, or what it cost her to make something beautiful out of almost nothing. Number 5. Pork and beans baked with brown sugar and molasses. Different from the baked beans earlier, this is the long version, the slow version. Dry white beans soaked overnight, layered in a deep pot with strips of salt pork and onion, covered in a sauce made from brown sugar, molasses, dry mustard, and a bit of vinegar, then baked low and slow for 6 or 8 hours until the beans absorbed everything around them and turned the color of dark caramel. This was New England cooking that spread south and west through immigrant and working-class communities all through the 19th and early 20th century. A pot of this cost almost nothing and fed everyone. Alcatraz had it on regular rotation. Free families had it when the budget allowed for molasses and the stove could be kept going long enough. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That pot of beans, made the long way, is one of the most nutritionally complete meals a person can eat. Resistant starch, plant protein, iron, B vitamins, slow-digesting complex carbohydrates that keep a working body fueled for hours. The women who made it knew what it did for a body. They didn't need a label to tell them. Number 4. Scrambled eggs. This one is simple and it hits hard. Eggs were not guaranteed in a Depression-era household. If you had chickens, you had eggs until the chickens stopped laying, or the winter got too cold, or you needed the money from selling the eggs more than you needed the eggs. Families who kept hens rationed their eggs with intention. Who got them? How many? Which meal? A woman who had 4 eggs and 5 people made decisions before breakfast that most people today will never have to make. Alcatraz served fresh scrambled eggs every morning as a standard breakfast item, every morning, without rationing, without calculation, without the thing underneath the thing. Free children grew up learning not to expect eggs every day. The men on the rock had them daily as a given. That is not a footnote. That is the whole argument. Number 3. Clam chowder. The bay was right there. It was always right there. And the Alcatraz kitchen used it. Fresh clams, potatoes, onion, cream, a bit of thyme, salt pork rendered in the bottom of the pot first for depth. San Francisco clam chowder in the 1930s was working food, wharf food, fisherman food, the food of the Italian and Portuguese communities that worked the bay. They made it because the clams were there, and the clams were cheap, and the chowder kept you warm when the bay wind came in off the water. But by the time it reached the Alcatraz kitchen, Made with cream and fresh clams on a federal budget, it had crossed from working food into something the fishing families who supplied those clams often couldn't afford themselves. Today we serve it in a sourdough bread bowl for $16 and call it a San Francisco tradition. Grandma just called it chowder. She made it when the clams were cheap and the cream could be justified. It was never poor food. It was always genius. Number 2, roast beef. This is Sunday dinner in America, the mythological version. The version that actually happened in working-class homes only on the rarest of occasions, when the money was there and the family needed a reason to sit together and remember what abundance felt like. A beef roast in the 1930s was a statement. It meant something had gone right. It meant the week had been good enough. It meant the children could eat until they were full, and the mother could sit down for a moment without calculating the next thing. Alcatraz served roast beef with vegetables on rotation. Not for holidays, not for occasions, for Tuesday, for Thursday, for whatever day the menu called for it. The kitchen staff browned the roast, let the vegetables fall into the drippings and cook alongside it, and served it to men doing federal time for crimes against the country that had given them better food than it gave its most vulnerable free citizens. Nothing about that is accidental. Nothing about that is ironic. It is a policy. It was always a policy. Number 1, ice cream. Actual ice cream. This is the one. This is the one that puts the whole picture into focus. The Alcatraz food program included ice cream, served to inmates as a dessert item, particularly on Sundays and holidays, but documented in the kitchen logs with enough frequency to make clear it was not a rare occurrence. Ice cream in the 1930s was not an everyday food for most American families. A quart of commercial ice cream cost about 25 cents. For families spending 7 to 10 cents per person per day on all food combined, ice cream was a luxury that fell outside the category of possibility for months at a stretch. Children who grew up during the Depression remember ice cream the way they remember the one orange at Christmas, as something bright and rare and meaningful, something that marked a day as different from all the other days. On Alcatraz, it was served on a rotation to men who had broken federal law. In a prison the government used as a symbol of its toughest, most uncompromising justice, they ate ice cream. Free children counted the days until they could afford a cone. That is the whole story right there. That is all of it. Closing, make the beans the long way. Soaked overnight, slow-cooked with molasses and salt pork until the kitchen smells like something a grandmother would recognize. Pull out the cast iron and fry the chicken the way it was meant to be fried, in hot lard, low enough to cook through, long enough to build a crust that shatters when you bite into it. Make the bread pudding from the bread that's going stale. Pour a little vanilla over the top. Let it tell you what it is. The women who made these meals, in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, in the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta, in the tenement kitchens of lower Manhattan, in the farmhouses of the Oklahoma Panhandle, they were not cooking poor food. They were cooking with intelligence and precision and love, under conditions that would break most modern cooks in an afternoon. They stretched a chicken carcass into 3 meals. They built complete nutrition from a 5-cent bag of beans. They transformed stale bread into something worth eating twice. They knew things about food and the human body and the alchemy of a low flame and a heavy pot that we have nearly lost entirely. The United States government, in 1934, at the bottom of the worst economic crisis in the country's history, made a deliberate choice to feed its most dangerous criminals better than it fed its most vulnerable free citizens. Warden Johnston put it in the budget. The food industry finished the job. Kraft and General Mills and the processed food machine of the 1940s and 1950s convinced 2 generations of American families that the box was progress and the scratch pot was old-fashioned, and by the time anyone noticed what had been lost, the grandmothers who carried that knowledge were mostly gone. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and they knew it too. That is not progress. That is the longest con ever run on the American kitchen. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. I want to know what she called it. I want to know what it smelled like. I want to know if anyone in your family still makes it. Because that knowledge belongs to all of us. And it's not gone yet. Not entirely. Not if we start talking about it now. Number 3, clam chowder. The bay was always there. That is what makes this story hurt in such a specific way. The water was full of food. Cold Pacific currents carried clams, crab, fish, mussels. Entire ecosystems moving beneath the fog while families on shore struggled to afford dinner. San Francisco in the 1930s smelled like salt water and diesel fuel and sourdough bread cooling in bakery windows. The waterfront was crowded with fishermen from Italian and Portuguese families who understood the bay the way farmers understand weather. They knew where the clams were thickest. They knew which tides mattered. They knew how to turn inexpensive seafood into meals that could carry a working man through another freezing morning on the docks. Clam chowder began as practical food, not trendy food, not tourist food, survival food. You made it because clams were available. Potatoes were cheap, onions kept well, salt pork added fat and flavor. Cream, when you could spare it, transformed the whole thing into something comforting enough to make people forget how cold they were for 20 minutes. A heavy pot of chowder simmering on the stove could feed an entire family. More importantly, it created the illusion of abundance that matters more than modern people realize. Poor communities survive partly on morale. A thin broth feels like scarcity. A thick chowder feels like care. So grandmothers stirred flour into cream and rendered pork fat slowly and stretched every ingredient until the pot became bigger than the sum of its parts. That is culinary intelligence. And then the same ingredients entered the Alcatraz kitchen under a federal budget. Fresh clams, cream, potatoes, aromatics. Prepared in industrial quantities for inmates housed on an island prison sitting directly in the middle of the bay itself. Think about the symbolism there. Fishing families harvested the clams. Working-class labor moved the supplies. Federal money purchased the ingredients. And prisoners consumed a richer version of the meal than some of the families who harvested the food in the first place. That is not satire. That actually happened. Today, people pay absurd amounts of money for authentic San Francisco clam chowder served in sourdough bread bowls overlooking Finwisherman's Wharf. Tourists photograph it like it is cultural theater. But to Depression-era families, chowder was never performance. It was engineering. It was warmth converted into calories. It was a mother trying to make her children feel full before bed. It was fishermen eating something hot after spending 12 hours in freezing wind. It was old-world cooking techniques surviving in tiny kitchens because immigrants carried those recipes across oceans when they had little else. And that knowledge mattered. Those cooks understood layering flavor in stages. They knew salt pork had to render slowly first. They knew potatoes thickened broth naturally if cooked long enough. They knew cheap ingredients could become luxurious if treated patiently. Modern food culture often mistakes expensive ingredients for skill. Depression cooking proved the opposite. Skill was what happened when ingredients were scarce. That is why these meals endure emotionally. They contain memory inside them. A bowl of chowder is not just potatoes and clams. It is waterfront labor, immigration history, family sacrifice, weather, poverty, adaptation, community knowledge. And somewhere inside all of that sits the uncomfortable truth that the federal prison system had enough money to serve rich chowder consistently, while free citizens nearby struggled to justify cream at the grocery counter. People want history to separate neatly into heroes and villains, rich and poor, freedom and punishment. But the Depression blurred those categories into something deeply unsettling, because sometimes the prison had certainty and the outside world did not. Number 2, roast beef. Roast beef was never just dinner. It was evidence. Evidence that the week had gone well enough for a family to pause survival mode for one evening and experience something dangerously close to comfort. In working-class America during the 1930s, beef occupied a strange emotional territory. People dreamed about it constantly, but purchased it cautiously. A roast large enough to feed an entire family represented real money, money that usually had 10 other responsibilities attached to it before anyone even entered the butcher shop. Rent came first. Coal came first. Shoes for the children came first. Medicine came first. A roast happened only when those other emergencies loosened their grip for a moment. That is why Sunday dinners became sacred in so many American households. Not because people were sentimental by nature, but because scarcity turns ordinary pleasures into ceremonies. When a mother carried a roast to the table, everybody understood the significance immediately. You sat straighter, you ate slower. Fathers carved carefully so every plate looked fair. Vegetables cooked in beef drippings tasted rich enough to make children silent for a few precious minutes. For one meal, the family could pretend abundance was normal. That illusion matters more than historians sometimes acknowledge. Human beings need psychological nourishment, almost as much as physical nourishment. A roast dinner said, "Things may still be hard, but tonight we are together and nobody is leaving hungry." Then there was Alcatraz. Roast beef appeared there not as celebration, but as scheduling. Tuesday, Thursday, rotation menu, institutional routine. The prison kitchen browned massive cuts of beef, let carrots and onions soften in rendered drippings, thickened gravies from pan scrapings, and served complete hot meals to inmates according to federally approved nutrition standards. Again, people misunderstand why this shocks us. It is not because prisoners ate food. It is because millions of free Americans could not reliably access the same quality of protein with the same consistency. The government understood that morale affected prison control. Well-fed inmates were easier to manage. Predictable meals reduced conflict. Nutrition protected labor capacity and institutional order, so the state invested accordingly. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, entire regions of America survived on beans, cornbread, potatoes, and whatever meat flavoring could be stretched across the week. Some families used a single ham hock repeatedly until there was almost nothing left but bone. Others relied on gravy to imitate richness. Children learned to chew slowly because it made meals last longer. And then newspapers printed stories about Alcatraz serving roast beef. Imagine reading that while standing in a bread line. Imagine hearing that while cutting mold from yesterday's loaf. Imagine explaining to your children why convicted bank robbers ate better protein than they did. People today often reduce the Depression to black and white photographs and vague stories about hardship. But food exposes the emotional reality underneath the statistics. You can measure inequality very clearly by asking a simple question: who got meat and how often? At Alcatraz, the answer was institutionalized regularity. Outside Alcatraz, the answer depended on luck. And yet the women cooking in those struggling households still managed miracles. They browned onions to deepen flavor. They turned drippings into gravy. They stretched vegetables beneath the roast so nothing was wasted. They created beauty inside limitation. That deserves more respect than it gets, because real cooking is not excess. Real cooking is transformation. And nobody transformed scarcity more skillfully than Depression-era mothers standing over heavy ovens, trying to make one roast feel large enough to hold an entire family together for another week. Number 1, ice cream, actual ice cream. Not frozen flavored syrup, not shaved ice. Not the watered-down, homemade versions families sometimes improvised when money disappeared and children still wanted something sweet during the summer heat. Real ice cream. Cream, sugar, eggs, vanilla, churned frozen, served cold enough to feel luxurious. This is the detail that pulls the entire Alcatraz story into focus because ice cream was never nutritionally necessary. Nobody argued that inmates required it for survival. Bread was survival. Beans were survival. Potatoes were survival. Ice cream existed entirely in the category of morale, comfort, pleasure, humanity. And that is exactly why it matters. During the Great Depression, Most American families organized their grocery spending around necessity alone. Every nickel had an assignment before it even entered the house: flour, lard, salt, coffee if the week had gone well enough. Sugar carefully rationed because children still deserved birthdays even during hard times. A quart of commercial ice cream cost roughly 25 cents in the 1930s. That number sounds tiny now, but during the Depression, 25 cents could represent an entire day's food budget for multiple people. For many households, ice cream sat outside the boundaries of realistic possibility. It became celebration food, holiday food, memory food. Children remembered the rare occasions they got ice cream with startling precision decades later because scarcity brands joy into the mind differently. They remembered the flavor, the weather, the exact shape of the cone. They remembered how slowly they ate it because they already understood, even as children, that the experience would not return anytime soon. Some families stretched one small serving among several children. Others made homemade versions with less cream and more ice, hoping the children would not notice the difference. Parents became experts at manufacturing delight from almost nothing because disappointment had become too common inside American homes. And meanwhile, inside the most notorious federal prison in the country, inmates received actual ice cream on scheduled rotations, Sundays, holidays, institutional dessert service. The government recorded it plainly in kitchen logs, almost casually, as though this were entirely ordinary. Maybe that is the strangest part of all, the calmness of it. Nobody inside the prison administration considered ice cream controversial. They considered it practical. A content inmate population was easier to manage. Better meals reduced unrest. Small comforts stabilized institutional behavior. So ice cream remained on the menu while free families outside prison walls counted pennies beside grocery shelves, trying to decide whether butter or kerosene mattered more that week. Think about the emotional contradiction buried inside that reality. A child in rural Kansas might spend 6 months dreaming about ice cream, while a convicted criminal on Alcatraz received it according to schedule, not because he earned it, not because he deserved it morally, but because the federal system believed psychological stability inside prison had administrative value. And maybe that is what unsettles people most about Depression-era America. The government clearly understood the relationship between dignity and food quality. They just applied that understanding selectively. Because ice cream is not really about dessert. It is about what a society considers acceptable